She walked into an Ivy League lab, as the only black girl in the room. And before she even opened her notebook, the professor pointed and laughed. Just a girl? You won't keep up here. But when his high-profile experiment began to spark, she was the only one who noticed a fatal flaw in the setup. A flaw that could have shut down the entire lab. She raised her hand to save the project, and they silenced her. What happened next? No one at Langston was ready. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Langston University wasn't just a campus, it was a monument to legacy. Red brick buildings, marble statues of long-dead scholars, and century-old oak trees cast shadows as heavy as the traditions they protected. Inside those halls, the scent of varnished wood and ancient books clung to the air like authority itself. Room 212, the Advanced Theoretical Physics Lab, was where brilliance was either born or broken. Kennedy Walker stepped through its door, clutching her laptop to her chest, nerves flaring beneath her calm exterior. Her heart thudded like an anxious metronome, every beat echoing with the words her mother had repeated over the phone the night before. Don't just show them what you know, show them who you are. She wanted to believe that would be enough. But this was Langston. She had made it here on raw brilliance, and a full academic scholarship, not by legacy or recommendation letters, written over golf club cocktails. She was the only black student in the room, one of only 3 women, and the only one not already on a first-name basis, with someone in the faculty. Kennedy took the second-row seat, just close enough to show she was serious, but not so close she seemed eager. Her Langston hoodie sat crisp against her pressed jeans, her braids wrapped into a low bun, neat and intentional. She opened her notes and exhaled slowly, willing herself to feel ready. A white boy to her left leaned toward his friend and whispered, "She looks like she's lost." Before she could process it, the room went still. The door creaked open, with precision, and in walked Professor Alden Monroe, tall, steel-haired, and wrapped in the kind of arrogance that only tenure and silence could buy. He didn't acknowledge the student. He merely walked to the board, his leather shoes clicking against the tile, and uncapped a marker like it was a sword drawn. As he turned to scan the class, his eyes flicked past Kennedy, then returned. A beat. 2. His brow lifted. "You," he said flatly, pointing. "Name?" Kennedy swallowed. "Kennedy Walker." He chuckled, not loud, but deliberate. "Interesting," he muttered. "We don't usually see Walkers in this department." A few heads turned. Someone coughed a laugh. "Walker," he repeated, tasting the name like it was unfamiliar. "You know this is advanced theoretical physics, correct?" "Yes, Professor," she said, keeping her voice steady. He nodded. "Well, let's hope you can keep up. Physics at this level, it isn't forgiving, especially if you're just a girl." The words slammed into the room like a dropped weight. Someone stifled a gasp. Others looked away. Kennedy didn't blink. She wouldn't give him that. But inside, her stomach turned. She'd heard the phrase before. In high school, when she solved equations faster than her teacher. At internships, when male mentors talked over her. But hearing it here in front of 20 others made it burn differently. Professor Alden continued like nothing had happened. He scribbled a complex multivariable equation on the board. "Let's begin. Today we'll discuss inertial frames and rotational reference anomalies. This equation here," he said, gesturing, "governs the rotational behavior of rigid bodies in 3-dimensional space." Kennedy already knew it. Euler's equations of motion. She had run simulations on them all summer. She also knew something else. The setup on the board was wrong. Not drastically, but dangerously. The torque vector had been misapplied, an axis mislabeled. Small mistake. But in the lab simulation that would follow, it could throw off the entire system and overload the feedback. She raised her hand. The room froze. Alden turned, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, Miss Walker." She hesitated. "The vector, the rotation around the z-axis. I think you labeled it as clockwise, but with the right-hand rule, it should be." His marker slammed against the desk. "That will be enough," he said coldly. You were just interrupting the lecture to correct something you haven't even tested," he said. "This is not high school. We don't blurt out guesses." Kennedy's throat tightened. "It's not a guess, sir. The setup." I said that's enough. The silence was unbearable. Even the hum of the projector seemed louder now. Alden turned back to the board. "We'll be entering the lab in the second half of the class. Hopefully the hands-on work will clarify things for those less comfortable with theoretical rigor. Kennedy wanted to disappear. She wanted to scream. She wanted to do both. But instead she opened her notebook, flipped to a clean page, and drew the corrected setup herself, labeling each axis, each rotation, each torque value, slowly, deliberately, while her ears burned, and the rest of the room scribbled notes around the professor's flawed diagram. She could feel the eyes on her. She could feel herself shrinking. Or maybe, she thought, she was just being cut down. The second half of class moved into the lab. White floors, polished counters, and experimental setups built to simulate rotational motion. Kennedy was grouped with 3 others, none of whom made eye contact with her. Professor Alden made the rounds, checking each group, offering suggestions. When he got to Kennedy's table, he didn't speak, just stood behind her as the simulation launched. The machine beeped, then shuddered. An error flashed across the screen. Torque misalignment. System unstable. Kennedy's group panicked. What happened? What did you touch? I didn't touch anything, Kennedy said. Alden stepped forward. What's going on here? Kennedy pointed to the setup. It's the vector. The axis was mislabeled in the diagram. That's why it's failing. He stared at her, then looked at the machine. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he reached past her and powered it down. Let's reset, he said, to no one in particular. Then to Kennedy, don't interfere again unless you're absolutely sure.
I was sure, she said softly.
Confidence without correctness is just noise. He walked away. The others looked at her like she was radioactive. Kennedy stood in the silence, her heart thudding with rage. But as she watched Alden instruct the next group, using the corrected vector now, she realized something else. He knew she was right. He just couldn't let her be seen being right. She turned back to her station, and that's when she noticed it. A faint hum, out of rhythm. A heat signature rising too quickly. The power supply wasn't just reacting to torque misalignment, it was building toward an overload, and no one else had seen it. The entire lab was humming with rising energy, and Kennedy was the only one who knew something was about to go very, very wrong. The low hum of the lab still echoed in Kennedy's ears long after class ended. She replayed it in her head, the rising heat, the warped sound of overloaded circuitry, and Alden's quick silent fix using her correction, without a shred of acknowledgement. He hadn't credited her, hadn't even made eye contact, just tweaked the vector mid-round and moved on like nothing had happened. That night, Kennedy sat alone in her dorm room, her fingers twitching over the keyboard. She could have emailed the department head. She could have filed a complaint, but the rules here weren't written in handbooks. They were carved into the walls, unspoken. Inherent. Langston's science department was a fortress, but not everyone had the key. In lecture halls and lab floors, there were names that opened doors before a GPA even landed. Maddox, Layton, Wexler, surnames carved into buildings, into plaques and donor walls. Legacy students carried themselves like they were already faculty. Shoulders back, voices loud, confident in the knowledge that nothing they said would be second-guessed. Kennedy, meanwhile, walked with caution, alert to every raised eyebrow, every glance that lingered just a moment too long on her skin, her hair, her silence. She had learned quickly that this wasn't about intellect. It was about belonging. And belonging here had nothing to do with how well you knew thermodynamics. It was in the unspoken rules. Like how white students casually left lab coats on their chairs between classes, while hers was once thrown in the lost and found bin, with a note that read, "No ID, unclaimed." Like how the elevator keycard stopped working on the research floor the day after she challenged Alden's equation. Only hers. Like how her lab reports returned slower than everyone else's, often with vague notes. Try to be more precise. Precise how, though? Numbers didn't lie. But apparently who delivered the numbers still did. It wasn't just Alden. It was the system around him, built to protect his authority. Kennedy watched the boys around her submit half-thought ideas, and still get praised for thinking outside the box. Meanwhile, she stayed up till 3 a.m., refining equations, only to be told she was too technical, too rigid, not collaborative enough. At first she thought she was overthinking it. Then she saw the patterns. Her white lab partner, Jonah Wexler, grandson of that Wexler, submitted a project using data she had gathered and organized. When it earned a departmental spotlight, her name wasn't even mentioned. Not once. When she brought it up to him, he looked confused. "You're overreacting, Kennedy. It's a group project. We all contributed." "No, Jonah," she said calmly. I wrote the algorithms. You formatted the slides. He blinked. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, or whatever. Maybe you're just not a good fit for the lab culture here. The word fit stuck like glass in her throat. Kennedy didn't say anything. She just walked away. But her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. The next week, she started arriving early and staying late. Not to be better. She already was. But to prove it in ways they couldn't erase. She documented everything. Backed up her work. Time-stamped versions. Coded her own signatures into the simulation. Quietly, methodically, she built her wall of proof. Still, the environment chipped at her. In the cafeteria, she sat alone. At department mixers, no one approached. In team meetings, her ideas were met with shrugs, until someone else repeated them louder, and suddenly they became brilliant. One afternoon, Professor Alden handed out practice problems. Complex derivations involving torque, angular momentum, and vector calculus. Kennedy spotted an error. Again. This time she hesitated. She stared at the sheet, heart racing. Was it worth saying something? But the flaw wasn't small. It would propagate across every equation, corrupt every solution. She raised her hand. The room fell still. Alden looked over. Yes, there's a sign error in the vector expression. Here. She circled it. He approached, examined it, said nothing for a beat. Then he nodded once, slowly. Very well. No credit. No acknowledgement. Just a pause, and a shift. The next day, Kennedy's lab station was moved. No explanation. Her project folder on the shared drive disappeared. She had backups, thankfully, but her access credentials had mysteriously expired. IT claimed it was a system-wide update. Yet everyone else's accounts were untouched. She went to the TA. I can't do anything, he said, not meeting her eyes. Professor Alden manages permissions directly for this course. Kennedy's voice stayed level. Then can you ask him to restore mine? The TA hesitated. Off the record? Don't push him. Just keep your head down. You're not one of them. That makes you a target. She went quiet. Her stomach sank. Because the TA didn't sound threatening. He sounded worried for her. But it was already too late. At the next lecture, Professor Alden projected her homework onto the board. Without her name. Without context. Let's dissect a common mistake, he said. He walked the class through each line of her logic. Out of context. Removed from the problem. And framed it as a misinterpretation. The students laughed politely. Kennedy sat frozen. Every cell in her body screaming. He had twisted her work. Not because it was wrong, but because it was hers. And then came the twist she hadn't anticipated. Later that night, she returned to her dorm and found a printout slid under her door. It was her original lab report. But someone had scribbled across it in thick red ink. Diversity points don't earn degrees. No signature. Just those words. She stood there, holding the paper, her fingers trembling. This wasn't just microaggression. This was targeted, meant to break her spirit. But she didn't cry. She took a photo, then filed it into the folder she had quietly begun building, a folder labeled insurance. What she didn't know yet was that someone had already accessed her private notes. 2 days later, Kennedy's next lab project was flagged for plagiarism, using code she hadn't even submitted yet. By the third week of the semester, the rhythm of Langston University's physics department had settled into its hierarchy, sharp as clockwork, silent as tradition. The air inside the advanced research wing always carried a faint chemical tang of graphite and ozone, the scent of experiments in constant motion. For Kennedy Walker, that air had begun to feel heavier by the day. She sat at her usual lab station, fingers gliding over the worn pages of her black-bound notebook, her lifeline. Every equation, observation, and correction she had made since orientation lived inside it. It wasn't just notes. It was her proof. Proof that she wasn't a charity admission. Proof that every late night and every correction she'd made to Alden's equations had come from her own mind. That afternoon, the lab was a hum of murmured calculations and humming equipment. Students in pressed lab coats moved like clock hands, careful not to disturb the hierarchy. Kennedy kept her head down, focused on her final draft for the rotational symmetry project, a paper that was supposed to cement her place in the research circle. It was clean, elegant, airtight, and weeks ahead of the deadline. When the bell chimed, she slid her notebook into the metal drawer beneath her workstation, locked it and tucked the key inside her backpack's front pocket. Before heading out, she lingered a moment at the door, glancing back, For a fleeting second, she could almost believe she belonged here. But belonging at Langston had a way of vanishing without warning. The next morning, Kennedy arrived to find her workstation drawer slightly ajar. The lock had been forced, not shattered but pried open with precision. Her notebook was gone. Her pulse spiked. She checked every pocket, every corner. Nothing. For a few seconds she just stood there, her hand still resting on the open drawer. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "No, no, no." The other students trickled in, indifferent. A few gave her curious looks when she knelt to check the floor. Nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody ever did. Professor Alden entered the lab moments later, his eyes sweeping the room with mechanical indifference. "Everyone, settle in," he said. "We'll begin the second phase of the rotational models today." Kennedy forced herself to stand. "Professor Monroe," he turned, expression already tight. "Yes, Miss Walker. My notebook is missing. I keep all of my project data there, my observations, equations." He raised a hand. "I assume you have backups." "I write most of my initial data by hand," she said carefully. "It's how I cross-reference." Alden's lips twitched, almost into a smirk. "That's unfortunate. But this is an academic environment, not an art class. Perhaps this will teach you the importance of digital record-keeping." "It wasn't negligence, sir. Someone broke into my drawer." The room had gone still now, all eyes on her. Alden exhaled. "Miss Walker, you're implying theft. That's a serious accusation. Are you certain you didn't misplace it?" She blinked. "Misplace it? It was locked." "Then perhaps your memory is faulty," he said flatly. "It happens when students overextend themselves." Something in Kennedy cracked, not visibly, but deep, quiet, sharp. "I'm not overextended," she said, voice firm. "I know where I left it." He held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable second. "Fine. If you believe it's stolen, file a report with the department office." She did. But the office was worse. The secretary barely looked up from her computer, as Kennedy explained what had happened. "You're saying your notes were stolen? From a locked drawer?" "Yes," Kennedy said. "It's not the first time my materials have been tampered with." The woman's brow furrowed. "Do you have proof someone else had access?" "The drawer was forced open." The secretary shrugged. "Then maybe you forgot to lock it. We can't assume theft. These are competitive students. People make mistakes." Kennedy stood there, gripping her bag, her mind spinning. Mistakes? Her proof of weeks of work was gone, and all she got was a shrug. When she left, the corridors seemed to close around her. Cold marble, tall ceilings, gold-framed portraits of old white men who built the department and still stared down at her from the walls. Every plaque seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." By the time she returned to the dorm, exhaustion had sunk into her bones. She dropped onto her bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about calling her mother, but couldn't bring herself to explain what was happening. Her mother had fought too hard to get her here. Kennedy didn't want to sound like she was breaking. That night, she typed out everything she remembered from the missing notebook. Her equations, her notes on the torque experiment, the data patterns she could recall. Her fingers ached by the time she stopped. But even as she recreated, she knew it wasn't the same. It didn't feel like evidence anymore. It felt like defense. The next morning, a department-wide email landed in her inbox. Subject: Academic Integrity Review. Note: Body: Dear Ms. Walker, a recent review of project data has raised concerns regarding the originality of your submitted materials. You are required to attend an academic review hearing on Friday to discuss possible inconsistencies. Kennedy froze. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't submitted anything since the missing notebook. When she walked into the lab that day, the eyes that met her weren't curious anymore. They were judgmental. Whispered fragments floated across the room. Integrity hearing? Thought she was some prodigy. Guess that's over. Professor Alden stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed. "Miss Walker," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "when you're ready to discuss proper academic procedure, my door is open." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The tone of someone already convinced. She could barely hold her breath as she left the room. Her hands shook so hard she dropped her notebook replacement in the hallway. That Friday she sat before the academic board. 3 professors, 1 student representative. Alden wasn't there, but his presence filled the room like a shadow anyway. A gray-haired woman on the panel spoke first. "Miss Walker, it's come to our attention that sections of your prior lab reports share similarities with data found in another student's submission." Kennedy blinked. "That's impossible." My notes were stolen. Do you have evidence of that?
I filed a report.
Yes, said another panelist, flipping through papers. But there's no security footage or witness confirmation. She felt the blood drain from her face. So I'm being accused of stealing my own work. Silence. Finally, the chairwoman said, "We're not accusing, we're investigating. Until then, your project will be placed under review." Kennedy nodded once, biting the inside of her cheek. Understood. When she left, her reflection in the glass door startled her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because she looked exactly how they wanted her to look. Defeated. That evening, she sat in the nearly empty library, staring at the rows of physics journals. Around her, laughter echoed from students who didn't have to prove they belonged. The hum of printers and the shuffle of papers filled the silence like static. Her inbox pinged. A new message. From Jonah Wexler. Subject: "Hey, I think I found something." Her heart jumped. Jonah, her lab partner. Maybe, for once, someone was on her side. She opened the email. It contained a photo attachment, a blurry image of a notebook. Her notebook, its pages open, filled with her handwriting. But the photo wasn't from security footage. It was taken up close, from someone's hand. She zoomed in. A distinct gold bracelet reflected faintly in the corner of the photo. She knew that bracelet. It belonged to Jonah. Her hands went cold. Kennedy's missing notebook wasn't lost or misplaced. It was being read, page by page, by the person who just offered to help her clear her name. Kennedy stared at the email from Jonah Wexler for a full minute before her hand finally moved. She didn't reply, didn't forward it, just downloaded the image and dropped it into her encrypted folder marked insurance. Her thoughts swirled like a hurricane, sharp, circular, and exhausting. She had known something was off. She just hadn't known how deep it ran. That Monday, a new announcement hit the physics department. A high-profile cross-lab collaboration on quantum entanglement modeling would form a flagship research team, sponsored by Langston's biggest corporate donor, Halberton Dynamics. The project promised not only publication but possible internship placement at national labs. For any student in the room, it was the academic golden ticket. Kennedy was nominated. So was Jonah. On paper, it looked like progress. Professor Alden had even said her name. No sarcasm, no side glance. "Miss Walker will co-lead the modeling sequence," he announced, like it was an afterthought. But Kennedy had learned to read between the lines. They didn't expect her to succeed. They expected her to crash, and they would be there to record the fallout. Still, she showed up. She walked into the Langston Quantum Lab, with a backpack full of calculations, algorithms refined over nights of trial and error, and a stomach made of tempered steel. The group included Jonah, Spencer Maddox, and Elliot Brandt, two names that read like private equity firms, and carried the same smug entitlement. She was the only woman, the only black student, and the only one who actually understood the quantum model from the ground up. They didn't talk to her much during the initial weeks. She would submit code, provide theoretical scaffolding, correct their misfires in silence. Sometimes they took the help. Most of the time, they just passed it off as their own discovery. It didn't bother her at first. Not visibly. Kennedy wasn't here to make friends. She was here to prove them wrong. By week 3, the team had begun assembling the simulation model for entangled particles under a rotating frame. A complex idea that involved merging quantum superposition theory with inertial references. It was Kennedy's suggestion. She built the code from scratch, tested it on her own equipment first to avoid sabotage, and double-checked it through a custom sandbox. When she finally unveiled it during a team meeting, Spencer leaned back and said, "That's actually good," Jonah added. "Yeah, we could definitely polish it and pitch it." "Polish it," she repeated. Elliot smirked. "It's raw, you know what we mean." They took the code anyway. No acknowledgement. No citation in the team notes. No credit on the shared drive. Just silent theft, masked in group camaraderie. The presentation was scheduled for the upcoming department showcase, a major event where donors, faculty heads, and research fellows from across the country would attend. Projects would be streamed, recorded, and archived into Langston's Innovation Library. Kennedy stayed late the night before, running last-minute simulations, cleaning up visual displays, and perfecting the data flow. She submitted the final model to the group's shared server, fully labeled, time-stamped, and encrypted with her unique hash signature embedded into the code header. The next morning, she arrived early. The presentation room buzzed with nerves and excitement. Tables gleamed with brushed aluminum. Projection screens flickered with colorful data animations. Students rehearsed in corners. Professors milled about like royalty, in cardigan. Her team arrived 20 minutes late. Spencer walked in with coffee. Jonah and Elliot trailed behind, laughing about something on someone's phone. They barely looked at her. "You ready?" Jonah asked. "Been ready," she said.
They set up the slides.
Kennedy noticed it immediately. The opening frame flashed the project title in large glowing letters. Quantum Torque and Entangled Systems, a Langston Innovation Team project. By Spencer Maddox, Jonah Wexler, Elliot Brandt. Her name was gone. She blinked. Then again. "What slide is this?" she asked, already knowing. Jonah looked sheepish. "Oh, they gave us the wrong file, I think. Must be the draft version. I submitted the final file last night," she said. "Yeah, but we edited it a little. You'll still present though, right?" Spencer said, smiling like this was normal. "I mean, you're great with the mathy parts." She stared at him. "You cut my name." "We didn't cut it," Jonah replied quickly. "It's just not on this version. It's a mistake." "No," Kennedy said quietly. "You made the mistake." But the presentation was starting. A faculty assistant waved them up. Kennedy stood frozen at the edge of the room. Every instinct screamed to walk away, to let them drown in their ignorance. Instead, she walked up to the podium and stood behind them. As they talked, she didn't flinch. She listened to Spencer recite her introduction, listened to Jonah walk through her simulations, listened to Elliot misrepresent her calibration metrics. Then, in the Q&A, someone asked, "Can you explain the use of frame dragging in your rotation model? It's not standard in most entanglement visualization." Jonah fumbled. Spencer gave a half-baked response about relativity. Kennedy stepped forward. "That's because I used a lens-throwing approach in the simulation design," she said clearly, addressing the questioner. "It adds accuracy in rotating frames by accounting for gravitomagnetic effects. I wrote the algorithm last week." There was a pause. The room shifted. The professor who had asked nodded. "Interesting choice. Innovative." Spencer forced a smile. "Yeah, Kennedy was super helpful in developing that." Another professor raised an eyebrow. "So she co-developed the code?" Elliot hesitated. "We all contributed," but the tone had changed. Doubt hung in the air now. Eyes flicked from Kennedy to the others. Afterward, donors approached, but they approached her. "I've never seen frame dragging applied like that," one said. "Are you a double major in math?" another asked. Spencer and Jonah stood off to the side, stunned. Later that night, Kennedy returned to the lab to retrieve her backup files. She needed to archive everything. She couldn't risk it disappearing again. That's when she saw it. On the shared drive, buried deep in the metadata of the presentation file, was a log. "Last edited, Jonah Wexler. 3 changes, removed name. K. Walker from credit slide. Reason for edit. Simplify contributors list." She took a screenshot. Then she printed it. Not for revenge. Not yet.
Just insurance.
The next morning, while walking across campus, she heard her name whispered again. But this time it wasn't ridicule. It was curiosity. Then, later that afternoon, she passed Jonah in the library. He looked up. Looked guilty. And in his panic he said something he thought she didn't hear. She was never supposed to be in the final credits anyway. Alden said not to. Kennedy stopped walking, the world tilting beneath her, because it wasn't just her teammates who erased her. Her own professor had ordered it. Kennedy hadn't slept since hearing Jonah's slip in the library, a whisper that detonated in her chest and set everything around her on fire. Alden said not to. It hadn't been a random oversight, or even a teammate's betrayal. It was institutional, top-down, calculated. She walked campus differently now. Every brick path and iron gate seemed to watch her, to hold some secret whispered behind mahogany doors. And Kennedy? She was just the wrong name, in the right room, a glitch they were trying to code out. Then came the newsletter. A polished digital spread sent to every faculty member, research sponsor, and student within Langston's prestigious STEM departments. The front page featured 3 students for their innovative research contributions during the recent project showcase. Kennedy was pictured at the podium, her diagram glowing behind her. "STEM Stars of Langston," it read, and beneath her photo, Kennedy Walker, BS Physics 27, Advanced Application of Lens-Throwing Frames in Quantum Models. It was the first time she had been formally credited for anything. No one could deny her innovation now. She almost allowed herself to smile. Until the comment appeared. It wasn't on the newsletter itself. Langston kept those polished and moderated. It showed up on langstonforum.com, an unofficial, uncensored student-run board, where the university's real opinions lived. Thread title: That Kennedy girl isn't special, just lucky. The post was simple. A block of text under a burner username, Langston legit. Can we stop pretending this is about merit? Kennedy Walker is what happens when schools care more about optics than intelligence. Her math's probably spoon-fed by TAs. You don't land on a headline after one simulation unless someone's checking a diversity box. She's just another affirmative action baby. It hit like a sucker punch. No name attached. No signature. But everyone knew who it was about. Within hours, it had over 300 upvotes. Kennedy saw it when a floormate slid her phone across the dining table with a grim face. "You should see this," she said quietly. Kennedy read the words once. Then again, they didn't sting because they were new. They stung because they were ancient. Echoes from high school, from summer programs, from the look Alden gave her on the first day, like she had wandered in, off the street. Affirmative action baby. 3 words. That was all it took to make students look at her differently. By the evening, the line had slipped into casual hallway conversations. "She's smart, but she got in with help. Probably a scholarship for first-gen kids. I mean, good for her, I guess." Kennedy walked through campus invisible, and spotlighted all at once. Not celebrated, not feared, just inspected, like a specimen under a microscope she hadn't agreed to. The next day, someone had scrawled "Tion" in red marker on her dorm whiteboard. Not once. 3 times. Her RA offered to clean it. Kennedy said, "Leave it." Because now, the gloves were off. She spent that night digging into Langston Forum's backend. She wasn't supposed to know how. But Kennedy had spent her early teen years learning how to ghost through digital firewalls and reverse engineer data trails. Her father, before he left, had been a systems analyst. It was the one gift he'd left behind. She traced the burner account through IP logs, narrowing down VPNs, masking services, time zones. It took 4 hours, 3 scripts, and a login exploit she probably shouldn't have remembered. But then she found it. IP match, Langston campus. Registered device student lab admin. Kennedy blinked. That device wasn't in a dorm. It was tied to Lab Terminal C, the TA station assigned to graduate assistants rotating through Professor Alden's advanced physics classes. Not a student, not a troll. Someone inside the lab. She pulled up the login times. The post had been made at 2:11 a.m. 2 days prior. The only login to that terminal around that time? Yunmain, a.donmonroe.net. Kennedy froze. She checked again. The post wasn't from a random student. It came from Alden's lab terminal. Possibly Alden himself. Her breath caught in her throat. Not because she was surprised, but because she now had something real, tangible. Proof that this wasn't about one biased comment or a missed credit. This was a system built to undermine her from the inside out. But how to use it? She knew the department wouldn't believe her if she simply accused a tenured professor. Not without something they couldn't ignore. So, she started planning. She printed the metadata logs, time-stamped IP access sheets, and archived them in multiple drives. She even sent a copy to her mother, encrypted under the subject line, "Senior Thesis Draft." Still, the emotional weight didn't lift. The next week, Alden walked into class with the same cold ease, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't sat behind a screen and typed out a sentence designed to erase her dignity. When he passed by her desk, he paused. "Miss Walker," he said smoothly, "good work on the quantum showcase. I suppose even a flawed system produces occasional anomalies." She met his gaze without blinking. Or maybe the system's flaw was thinking people like me wouldn't notice. Alden smirked. "Careful. Arrogance isn't flattering, especially when it's not earned." She didn't respond. Because the only response that mattered now would come in code, not conversation. That night, Kennedy ran a forensic scan on the lab's admin server. Not to look for more comments, but for patterns. If Alden had posted about her, maybe he had done it before to someone else. Maybe her story wasn't isolated. Maybe there were others. That's when she found it. A hidden directory labeled Mentor Notes Alpha. Encrypted, masked. But she broke it open. Inside were draft memos, email attachments, and notes about student progress. But one note caught her eye. Subject line, "Walker's status update." Body, She's competent. Too confident. If she gets publication, it opens doors for future quotas. Best to guide her into project roles without authorship. The email was internal. Forwarded. The original sender was listed as Insider Lemon, Dean Robert Lehman. The comment hadn't just come from a lab terminal. It had started in the dean's office. Kennedy sat back from the screen, heart racing. She wasn't just fighting a professor, she was fighting an entire institution. And now, she had the first piece of proof. The department mixer took place in the wrought iron courtyard behind Langston's physics wing. String lights hung above the students and faculty, casting warm amber glows across tall columns and manicured hedges. But the glow couldn't reach Kennedy's shoulders. She hovered near the fringe of the event, a solo drink in her hand, laptop bag slung over one shoulder, every polite smile practiced and ready. Because she knew that here, in the social skin of academia, the bar was lower for her, and the judgment sharper. Inside the courtyard, groups gathered, alumni shaking hands with tenured professors, donors clad in American blazers, legacy students given front row attention. Kennedy watched them carefully, engaged but cautious. She heard her name mentioned occasionally. Walker. Yes, that girl with the quantum model. But rarely did someone address her directly. Rarely did someone say Kennedy Walker. Professor Alden Monroe arrived with slow certainty. His silver-threaded hair gleamed in the lantern light. His navy blazer buttoned with precision. He carried a leather portfolio instead of a drink. He wore the sort of stern authority that swallowed room temperature. He circulated, smiling at donors, and leaning in to exchange small talk about research grants and endowments. Meanwhile, he glanced at Kennedy. Not a look of invitation, more like inspection. Kennedy had long ago stopped expecting him to call her Kennedy. He'd always said either Miss Walker or worse, Miss K. At the board meeting last month, he dismissed her contribution as interesting, though not quite polished. At a faculty lunch, he introduced her work, and then referred to it as our ambitious student's prototype. Nothing malicious in tone, but everything in implication. She was a student, yes, but not quite maker, not quite peer, just our ambitious student. Tonight she clutched her glass of water and watched him talk to a donor across the patio. She heard snippets: innovation tier, visibility, pipeline, quota risk, words she didn't want to hear, but had come to expect. She recognized when he turned away from the donor, and his expression changed. Casual complaint, almost bored. Then he saw Kennedy. He raised an eyebrow. She didn't look away. She would. The semester's grades had come out 3 days earlier. Kennedy had submitted every assignment, drawn every diagram, delivered every algorithm with precision. Yet when she opened the portal, her grade for the midterm project was the assignment had been returned covered in red ink. Miss Walker, your approach is unorthodox and lacks fluency in traditional presentation form. Please see me during office hours. A week later, she had caught Alden in the hallway and asked Professor Monroe, "May I discuss the comments on my midterm? I believe my method aligns with the criteria." He shrugged. "I reserve my right to grade as I see fit. If you'd like feedback, I suggest you consult the T." He walked off. That night at the mixer, Kennedy's mind wandered to that grade. 3 students around her, white, male, had scored in the 90s with work she suspected she had improved upon. They'd received praise, very fluid logic, excellent narrative structure. She remembered sitting behind her laptop at 2 a.m., rewriting calibration steps until the numbers aligned cleanly, while others laughed in the corridor about beer and Friday night plans. Alden's conversation with the donor ended and he adjusted his blazer. He moved toward the refreshments table and paused beside Kennedy. The air felt colder. "Miss Walker," he said almost too softly but loud enough for the nearby attendees to hear, "I hope you're enjoying the evening." She nodded, steady. "Yes, Professor Monroe, thank you." He glanced at her glass. "Water. Could I get you something else? Sometimes ideas go best with something stronger." "No, thank you." He tilted his head. "Good. Because we'll need every clear mind for the showcase." He paused, then turned and walked away. Kennedy's heart intended to settle, but it didn't. Instead, it tightened. The phrase clear mind felt loaded. Did he mean someone like her needed to be clearer? Or someone like her shouldn't expect the same fluid path? Later, she approached a whiteboard near the lab corridor, where event guests had written their names to get access to the new Quantum Initiative mailing list. Kennedy waited in line. She overheard 2 voices, soft but unmistakable. Monroe's pushing Walker into the pipeline, said a donor, female, well-dressed in gray houndstooth, and pearl earrings. You know how it is. They picked her for optics. Good for diversity. Good for the brochure. Alden responded, voice smooth. Yes, Dr. Brooks. We need the pipeline. The donor board expects visible change, but we must channel her ambitions. If she publishes independently, it's riskier. Kennedy froze. She stared at the donor's name tag. Patricia Brooks, Halberton Dynamics. The same company sponsoring her quantum project. The conversation ended. Brooks smiled and moved away. Alden walked past Kennedy's side like a ghost, leaving her standing at the board. She held the sign-up pen, but the world tilted. She wasn't just left out. She was being managed. A visible example. A token for the optics of change. A lab tool. The grade in red ink. The name in omission. The algorithm copied and praised. None of it was random anymore. It was strategy. Later that night, Kennedy returned to her dorm and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Her adrenaline refused to let her sleep. She replayed the phrases pipeline, visibility. If she publishes independently, it's riskier. Her work might not be judged on its own merit. It might be judged on her race, her gender, her usefulness to the institution. The next morning, she walked into the lab with a different kind of silence. No papers fluttered. No machines hummed. She sat at her station and pulled out her personalized ledger of project versions, lab backups, and modification timestamps. She'd started logging everything the moment she traced the IP post that targeted her. Now she added a new layer. Dean's office conversation. 7:42 p.m. Patio. She opened her laptop. The screen filled with emails, logs, metadata, hidden directories. She needed more proof. She needed the donor's emails, the faculty minutes that confirmed what she'd overheard. But she knew finding those would take time and risk. That afternoon during seminar, Alden cold-called every student except her. He named them by first name, asked technical questions about torque vectors, quantum operators, and time dilation. Kennedy sat at her usual desk, front second row, but her hand stayed down, because in this place, calling your name could still be a trap. When he finally looked in her direction, his voice lacked welcome. Walker, any comments on the modeling sequence? He asked. She exhaled. Calm. Professor, the dataset's magnitude dimension increases by the Lorentz factor in non-inertial frames. That means, she paused, steady, that the entanglement fidelity drops when the rotational velocity exceeds a threshold we modeled earlier. Alden frowned. Very well. See me after. His tone was clipped. Later in his office, he slid her project notebook across the desk. Your grade is still pending. There are concerns about collaboration authenticity. Kennedy's pulse stuttered. Sir, I wrote the algorithm, bench tested it on my own rig, and documented the data. Everything is timestamped. He didn't look up. I understand. We'll proceed with caution. He leaned back. In the meantime, I expect you to attend our external lab visit this weekend. It's important for the initiative. She nodded. Yes, Professor. He gave a thin smile. Good. I'll drop the details via email. As she left the office, part of her sagged with dread. The other part flared with fire. Because this week the grade in limbo, the erased credit, the manipulated data, it all had meaning now, and she was at the edge of naming it. That evening she backed up her files in 3 separate locations. She copied the conversation log she overheard. She printed donor names and scheduled meeting dates. She even recorded the timestamp verified screenshot of the newsletter comment IP. She knew what Alden was doing, not just to her but to the whole lab pipeline. She also knew she was in the middle of it. But she was no longer silent. At the mixer's grand finale, as the string lights flickered, Kennedy slipped into the donor suite and saw Alden hand a personalized lab coat embroidered Walker to Patricia Brooks. Her name stitched but disconnected, proof that her place was pre-assigned. Langston's physics wing looked different. After dark, the buzz of ambition faded into silence. Fluorescent lights cast cold shadows on once crowded hallways, and even the hum of machines took on a menacing tone. The walls didn't feel like they were holding knowledge anymore. They felt like they were hiding something. Kennedy moved like muscle memory. Now, quiet steps, eyes forward, always alert. She had learned that at Langston, surviving wasn't about being the smartest in the room. It was about learning what no one said out loud. She was gathering simulation printouts from the lab copier. Around 10:47 p.m., when she heard the soft click of the back supply room door open. She didn't turn immediately. People worked late all the time. Or pretended to. Walker. A low voice. Careful. Measured. Kennedy turned slowly. It was Damon Shaw, a second-year lab tech with thick glasses and tired eyes. He handled most of the maintenance on experimental rigs and logged machine time for faculty. Older than the students but younger than the professors. Invisible to both. Damon, she nodded. He looked over his shoulder. The hallway was empty. Then he stepped into the supply room and motioned for her to follow. You didn't hear this from me, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But they're planning to shut your project down before finals. Kennedy blinked. Who's they? Admin. Faculty. It's Alden, mostly. But he's not working alone. Her fingers clenched around the paper in her hands. Why? Damon looked at her like she already knew the answer. You're gaining traction. Your last presentation got flagged by Halberton as a highlight. Word is, some folks in the donor loop want you leading the next research series. That's good, isn't it? He shook his head. Not when it threatens how they built this place. They think you're getting too visible, and Alden's not gonna let your name get attached to a published breakthrough, not if he can bury it before peer review. Kennedy felt the weight of it before she could find words. But my data is verified. The algorithm works. That doesn't matter, they'll say it's derivative, that it overlaps too much with existing models, that it's unclean. She stared at him. You've seen this happen before, haven't you? Damon didn't answer right away. Then, once. But she didn't push back. She transferred out. They made sure she couldn't get another lab partner. Who was she? Doesn't matter now. She's gone. But you're not. Kennedy nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. Why are you telling me this? He hesitated. Because I see you. And I see what they're doing. Because I know when something's rigged. And I don't mean the machines. She let the silence hang between them. Her chest rose and fell with quiet fury. Then Damon added. They meet Thursday mornings. Closed faculty review. Sometimes it's about funding. But when a student's name gets brought up, it's not random. Kennedy's mind raced. How do I prove it? Damon looked her in the eye. You don't prove it. You catch it. The next day, Kennedy visited an electronics shop off campus. She bought a discreet USB recorder, voice-activated, small enough to fit in her key fob. She knew if she was caught, it could mean immediate academic suspension. But at this point, silence was a different kind of death. She mapped out the department's private meeting room schedule and cross-referenced it with Damon's info. The next closed discussion was Thursday, 8:15 a.m., right before her lab block. She walked into the hallway at 8:10 and pretended to be looking for the wrong room, slipped past a distracted office assistant, palmed her key fob onto the ledge just inside the doorframe, between the wall trim and the floral arrangements. She didn't hear anything that day, but that night, alone in her dorm, she uploaded the audio file and listened. Alden's voice came through first. Unmistakable, clipped, controlling. She's becoming a liability. There's no point in waiting. If the Halberton Review Board asks for final verification, we cite academic concerns and procedural gaps. Another male voice. Dean Lehman. She's technically ahead of schedule. Do we have anything on file? Alden. Not yet. But we can flag her model as too derivative of her peers. We'll say she failed to submit proper sourcing protocols. Lehman. Won't that raise questions? Alden chuckled. She doesn't have allies here. The students think she's aggressive. The faculty think she's unteachable. It won't take much. Then silence. Then a new voice. Female. Familiar. Patricia Brooks. Halberton Dynamics. We backed this initiative for optics and performance, she said coldly. If she's a problem, cut her out now. We don't need a headline that spirals. Kennedy stared at her screen. She felt every muscle tense, a coiling storm in her gut. They weren't just trying to erase her name. They were building a narrative that she was difficult, dangerous, unworthy, so that when they stripped her of authorship, no one would blink. This wasn't sabotage by omission anymore. It was character assassination. And the twist. Patricia Brooks, the donor who'd accepted a lab coat with Kennedy's name stitched across it, had been part of the planning from the beginning. Kennedy pressed pause. The room was too quiet. She felt like screaming. Instead, she exhaled and opened her folder labeled insurance. She added the audio file. Then she opened a new document. Title: Chronology of Suppression. Walker versus Langston Physics. She started typing everything. Every erased name. Every red grade. Every overheard whisper. Every stolen credit. And now, every planned takedown. Because if they wanted to erase her, she'd leave them nowhere to hide. The next time she walked into Alden's lab, she left the USB recorder running, not in her pocket, but in the faculty drawer he always kept locked. And this time what she captured wasn't just strategy, it was something criminal. The USB recorder was no longer just insurance, it was ammunition. Kennedy had waited weeks for the right moment. She didn't expect it to come on a rainy Wednesday, when the sky bruised gray, and the hallways smelled like wet wool and printer ink. The lab was nearly empty, just her, Jonah, and Professor Alden, who had scheduled a quiet working session to refine student outputs before the Halberton showcase. Alden had left his drawer unlocked, for once. Kennedy acted like she was searching for a backup adapter. She leaned into the drawer, subtly palmed the recorder, clicked it on, and tucked it just beneath a stack of outdated circuit diagrams. The tiny red light flickered once, then still. The rest of the hour passed in silent stabs of tension. Alden muttered to himself as he reviewed simulations. Jonah nodded dutifully, still clearly trying to keep his distance from Kennedy without appearing obvious. When Alden called Jonah into his office, Kennedy knew it would be her only chance to leave without arousing suspicion. She pretended to be packing her bags slowly. When the door shut behind them, she returned to the drawer, retrieved the device, and slipped it into her pocket. That night, she sat on her narrow twin bed, back pressed against the cold dorm wall, laptop balanced on her knees. She played the recording with headphones on, alone, with nothing but the soft hum of her desk lamp. At first it was routine lab banter. Then at the 23-minute mark, Alden's tone changed. "She's not like the rest of us," he said casually. "Too sensitive, too black, too female. Everything's a struggle for her, even listening."
There was silence. Then Jonah's unsure voice, "But her model's solid, isn't it?"
Alden laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "The model's not the problem. The optics are. You give someone like her too much spotlight, and suddenly every student who failed out has an excuse." Then a new voice, unfamiliar, but distinct. Female. Likely faculty. "You think she'll make noise? She won't. They never do. They're too afraid to burn the bridges they think they just crossed." Kennedy hit pause. For a few seconds, all she could hear was the whoosh of her own blood rushing through her ears. They weren't just targeting her work. They were talking about her identity like it was an error in the system. She didn't sleep that night. But she didn't cry either. Instead, she composed a single message. Not to a journalist. Not to an administrator. But to someone she trusted. A girl named Celeste Ford from her high school robotics team. Now a media tech at an indie podcast collective. Celeste had always said, "If they won't hand us a mic, we build our own stage." Kennedy uploaded the audio clip. No subject line. No caption. Just the file. Then she went silent. The clip leaked 3 days later. No source. No explanation. But the internet didn't need one. The words themselves were a match dropped into dry forest. "She's not like the rest of us, too sensitive, too black, too female." The video, now paired with a black screen and white subtitles, spread across X, TikTok, and Instagram within hours. Langston Leaks started trending. Major equity pages reposted it. Activist accounts demanded Alden's resignation. Students across the country, especially black STEM majors, posted their own stories of being dismissed, erased, ignored. "I've been too sensitive. He said I was too loud in my presentation, too confident, too female. How's that for academic feedback?" Langston University's name trended for the first time in its history, and not for any Nobel breakthrough. Kennedy watched it all from behind her screen. She didn't like or share any of it. She didn't comment. She didn't tweet, because this wasn't a call for attention. It was evidence, and the world had finally heard it. Students on campus started whispering differently. Professors shifted uneasily in their offices. Alden didn't appear at 2 of his lectures that week. The lab closed early without notice, but Kennedy didn't gloat. She showed up on time. Headphones in, notebook open. Her work still spoke for itself. Until the email arrived. Subject: Academic Misconduct Notification. From Langston University Office of Conduct and Integrity. Dear Ms. Walker, we are aware of a recent breach in internal academic privacy related to confidential faculty conversations. A preliminary investigation has revealed circumstantial links to your presence in restricted lab areas. Until the investigation concludes, your access to the lab and your project materials will be temporarily suspended. Please report to Dean Lehman's office on Monday at 9. It hit her like a slap. She read it 3 times and still, the words didn't shift. They weren't protecting her. They were blaming her. Despite having proof of racism, despite Alden's voice recorded word for word, despite every social media post validating her pain, her erasure, her brilliance, Langston's response was to isolate her. Kennedy forwarded the email to her mother, with no message attached. Within minutes, her phone rang. "Tell me this isn't real," her mother said, breath caught between fear and fury. "It's real," Kennedy said. "They're punishing you?" Kennedy exhaled. "They don't see it as punishment. They see it as preserving the institution." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you want me to come down there?" "No," Kennedy said. "I need to do this on my own. Just keep the receipts I sent you. If anything happens, don't finish that sentence." Her mother cut in. "You're not alone. You never were." Kennedy hung up and sat still in her dorm, surrounded by books, folders, half-graded assignments. Her laptop pinged with a new article headline: "Langston Leak, Ivy League Racism Caught on Tape." Another: "The whistle was black, female and brilliant, but now she's under investigation." She watched the comments. Some were outraged. Some were skeptical. Some were venomous. Bet she edited the clip. Typical victim play. She probably leaked it for attention. Affirmative action strikes again. But Kennedy didn't flinch. Because the war had always been silent. Until now. That night she sat with her back to the dorm wall, eyes wide open, and made a decision she hadn't planned to make yet. She was going to show them everything. But not through a protest. Not through a speech. Through a lab presentation they couldn't ignore. A final project so precise, so undeniable, that even the board couldn't stamp it out. But when she checked her project server, everything she'd worked on, her files, models, equations, had been wiped. Every folder was gone, replaced by one single message: "You should have stayed quiet." The morning Kennedy stepped into the administrative wing of Langston University, the air itself felt rehearsed, like even the silence had been coached to sound neutral. The carpet was too plush, the walls too beige, and every face she passed seemed to flatten into polite indifference. The receptionist at the dean's office didn't meet her eyes. "You can go in," she said quietly, voice clipped, like even sympathy could be overheard. Dean Robert Lehman's office was large enough to hold a meeting of 20, but it somehow still felt crowded, with expectation, with judgment, with carefully chosen power. The man himself sat behind his mahogany desk, framed by shelves lined with donor plaques and photos of himself shaking hands with people whose names built this university. He didn't rise when she entered. "Ms. Walker," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." Kennedy sat, her hands were steady, her posture perfect. If they were going to script this scene against her, she refused to play it small. Dean Lehman folded his fingers together. "I assume you're aware of the current situation." She met his gaze. "If you mean the leaked recording, yes. I've heard it." A pause. His eyes flickered once. Irritation, maybe surprise. Then the calm mask returned. "We're not here to discuss the content of that recording," he said. "We're here to address your potential involvement in its release." Kennedy let that sit for a beat. "So you're investigating me, not him." "Miss Walker, the university takes all breaches of confidentiality seriously. The university also takes racism seriously," she said softly. "At least that's what the brochures say." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about race. This is about procedure." "Procedure?" she repeated. "A tenured professor was caught calling me too black and too female. And the procedure is to question me." He sighed. The tired sigh of a man convinced of his own fairness. "We understand your frustration. But emotions can cloud judgment. The investigation is designed to establish facts, not feelings." Kennedy leaned forward. "Then let's start with the facts. The clip is authentic." Alden said those words. Everyone heard them. "And instead of holding him accountable, you're trying to find out how the world found out." Lehman's eyes narrowed. "We're holding you accountable for a potential violation of the Langston Honor Code. Specifically, the unauthorized recording and distribution of faculty communications. That's a serious infraction." She stared at him. "Unauthorized recording?" He nodded. "Whether or not you shared it, it was taken from a restricted environment. That's a breach. So when a professor violates ethics, it's regrettable. But when a student exposes it, it's criminal? Watch your tone, Lehman said sharply. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of the antique clock filled the room, relentless and steady. Finally, Kennedy said, "You don't want justice. You want silence." "Ms. Walker," Lehman said, his voice lowering, "Langston University has survived centuries of scrutiny. It will survive this. I suggest you remember that before you jeopardize your future any further." Her throat tightened, but her voice didn't waver. "My future. You froze my scholarship, revoked my lab access, and told the press it was routine protocol. What future are we talking about?" He looked down at the papers in front of him, shuffling them like they were evidence of her guilt. "Your tuition waiver and research stipend have been placed on temporary hold pending the investigation. It's not punitive. It's procedural." "You keep saying that word," Kennedy said quietly. "But what you mean is protection. Just not for me." Dean Lehman's expression didn't change. "We'll review the matter internally. Until then, I strongly advise you to avoid further contact with Professor Monroe or the media. Any additional statements could complicate your position." "I haven't spoken to any media," Kennedy replied. "Not one. I've done everything by your rules, and somehow I'm still the problem." He sighed again, this time almost weary. "You're talented, Miss Walker. No one is denying that. But talent doesn't excuse recklessness. You've made yourself the center of something larger than you understand." Kennedy stood. "No," she said evenly. "You made me the center when you decided I was more dangerous for telling the truth than he was for living a lie." For a split second, something cracked in his mask. Irritation. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. But then it was gone. "This meeting is concluded," he said, his tone final. "You'll be notified of the committee's findings." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "If you're trying to bury this," she said, "make sure you dig deep. Because if it surfaces again, it won't be a leak. It'll be a flood." The click of the door behind her was deafening. By the end of the week, Kennedy's access to the research building was officially suspended. Her ID card no longer opened the lab door. Her student portal displayed a new status: pending conduct review, restricted access. She wasn't even allowed to retrieve her own notes. Emails from reporters began to fill her inbox. Some kind. Some predatory. One from a major network asked, "Would you be willing to speak about your experience as a black woman in science?" The words stung. They wanted her pain, not her data. Her friends, or what few she'd had left, kept their distance. The whispers on campus changed tone. "She's suing the school," someone said. "No, she's getting expelled. They're investigating her for leaking classified research." In the cafeteria, conversation stopped when she walked in. In hallways, students avoided her eyes. Even Jonah, who once begged for her help, crossed to the other side when he saw her coming. Langston's PR office finally issued an official statement. "Langston University is aware of the circulation of an unauthorized recording involving a faculty member. We are conducting a full review. The university stands firmly against discrimination and upholds the highest standards of integrity and confidentiality." It was a masterpiece of hypocrisy, a sentence that looked righteous and read rotten. And buried deep in the same release, one small line: "The student responsible for the breach has been placed under administrative review." No name, no detail. But everyone knew who they meant. Kennedy's phone vibrated nonstop that night. Messages, mentions, half-hearted condolences. Someone even DM'd her, "They'll make you the example." She deleted them all. Then she opened her encrypted folder again. She rewatched the leaked clip, reheard Alden's voice, calm, smug, secure. Too sensitive, too black, too female. Her anger was different now. Not the sharp kind that made her lash out, but the slow, focused kind that burned without flame. The kind that She printed every email, every report, every memo Damon had given her. She highlighted dates, matched timestamps, and began drafting a timeline, an internal map of everything they'd tried to erase. Her phone buzzed again. A new email. Subject: confidential decision notification. Sender: Dean Robert Lehman. She opened it. "Following the findings of the Academic Conduct Committee, Langston University has determined that your actions constitute a serious violation of university policy. Effective immediately, you are placed on academic suspension pending final review. During this period, your access to all university facilities, Digital systems and financial aid programs will remain revoked. At the bottom, one line stood out, a final sentence meant to sound merciful. You may appeal this decision through the Office of Student Integrity within 10 business days. Kennedy sat still. Her scholarship gone. Her lab access gone. Her name under review. The email's glow reflected on her face, soft and merciless. She read the last line again. You may appeal. And she whispered, almost to herself, no, I won't appeal. I'll expose. Kennedy looked up from the letter, because outside her dorm window, camera flashes were lighting the quad. Reporters had arrived, not to defend her, but to capture her fall. When Kennedy saw the name Raina Hollowell flash across her inbox, her fingers paused mid-keystroke. The subject line was simple, you're not alone. She hadn't heard that name in nearly 4 years. Dr. Raina Hollowell, her high school mentor, the first black physicist Kennedy had ever met in person, the woman who made her believe she belonged in quantum mechanics long before Langston's walls tried to prove otherwise. Raina had been more than a teacher. She was the first person who treated Kennedy's curiosity like brilliance, not a fluke. The one who stayed after school, when Kennedy wanted to simulate gravitational lensing in her senior project. The one who bought her a used copy of Gravitation by Misner, Thorne and Wheeler when the school wouldn't order it. The one who, when Kennedy got into Langston, cried harder than anyone in her family. Kennedy clicked open the message. It was short. I've seen the news. I've heard the clip. I don't need an explanation. I know exactly what this is. They build walls to break us. I'm still standing. And so are you. Call me. Attached was a number and a Zoom link. No pressure, just presence. That night, Kennedy waited until the quad quieted and her hallway dimmed. She clicked the link. Raina's face appeared on the screen. Older, wiser, but still wrapped in the warmth Kennedy remembered. Her locks were longer now, streaked with silver, but her eyes were just as alive. Hi, baby, Raina said. Kennedy broke, not with tears, but with breath. A release so heavy she didn't realize she'd been holding it for weeks. I didn't leak it, she said immediately. I swear, I recorded it. Yes. But I didn't. I know, Raina interrupted gently. I know. That's not why I called. Kennedy blinked. Then why? Raina leaned in, her voice lower. Because I've been where you are. 10 years ago, it was me, at Duke. They said I was angry. They said I was arrogant, too confident, too loud. And when I published a paper under my name, my advisor tried to pull funding mid-project. Kennedy's jaw clenched. What did you do? I finished the paper, Raina said, and I published it with receipts. Not to get even, but to outlast them. Kennedy shook her head. It's not just Alden. It's the dean, the donors. They froze my aid, pulled my project files, erased my name, blamed me for the leak. And still, Raina said, you're here. Kennedy met her eyes through the screen. You know what the scariest thing is? Kennedy whispered. I don't even want to prove them wrong anymore. I want to make sure no one else goes through this. Not here, not like this. Raina smiled, bittersweet. Then let's make a plan. They talked for over 2 hours. Raina had contacts. She wasn't just a high school teacher anymore. She was a researcher now at Emory, part of a think tank working on experimental particle models and rotating systems. She'd kept her head down for years, but she hadn't been quiet. She'd written, mentored and gathered allies, quietly building a foundation so that when someone like Kennedy needed to be lifted, it would be there. Kennedy shared everything. The red grades, the stolen simulations, the conversation logs, the donor audio. Raina listened without blinking. And then she said something Kennedy didn't expect. Do you still have the project files? Not on Langston servers, Kennedy said. But I backed everything up before they wiped it. In triplicate. Raina nodded. Good. Then it's time to present it. Not to Langston, but to the world. Kennedy frowned. Present it where? I'm suspended. I know, Raina said, but you're not silenced. The next morning, Raina sent her a forwarded message from one of her colleagues at the International Quantum Research Collective. It was an invitation. Subject: late edition speaker request. Global Physics Summit. Location: Boston. Panel: Emerging Models and Rotational Frame Quantum Mechanics. In bold at the bottom, suggested presenter Kennedy Walker, Langston University. Under independent review. Kennedy reread it twice. Is this real? She messaged. Raina replied. Every last atom of it. There were only 5 slots on that panel. all top-tier postdocs, international scholars, and rising stars in theoretical physics. It was where new paradigms were introduced, vetted, debated, and now, she'd been invited to share her rotational model, the very one Langston had erased. But it wasn't just a science summit. It was televised, streamed, recorded, watched. This wasn't just a second chance. It was a spotlight, and it was going to terrify them. Kennedy stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she clicked. Accept invitation. She didn't tell Langston. She didn't tell the press. She just got to work. Raina connected her with presentation designers, scientific reviewers, and a legal advisor who'd worked on academic suppression cases. Kennedy compiled her equations into clean visuals. She rebuilt her simulation interface with open-source software. She included references from high school to the current moment, a full paper with every citation documented. And in the opening slide, she placed one sentence. Suppression doesn't kill brilliance, it just makes it more precise. She rehearsed every night. She didn't sleep much, but for the first time in months, she felt something new coursing through her. Control. But Langston wasn't done yet. 2 days before the summit, a new article dropped in a conservative academic journal. The title read, "The Dangers of Unvetted Science, Affirmative Action in Advanced Research." The article never named her, but it cited her work directly, called it underdeveloped, politically inflated, and symptomatic of lowering standards in elite science programs. It claimed certain demographic trends were being prioritized over disciplinary rigor, and the author, Professor Alden Munro, her mentor, had moved from the shadows into print. He wasn't just erasing her now, he was preemptively discrediting her, hoping to taint the summit before it started. Kennedy sent the link to Raina. Raina replied with 3 words. Let him watch. As Kennedy boarded the flight to Boston, she received a notification. Someone had uploaded her original simulation files to an anonymous academic forum, with Alden listed as the sole author. The lights dimmed in the grand auditorium of the Boston Center for Theoretical Science, and Kennedy stood alone behind a curved glass podium, her breath steady but charged. The stage felt massive, far bigger than the Langston lab, or any classroom she'd known. Projected behind her was a single slide, a rotating particle diagram set against a grid of warped space-time. The summit's host had introduced her modestly, avoiding the words controversy, leak, or Langston. They simply said, next, a contribution from a student researcher whose bold modeling of rotational entanglement in non-inertial frames has sparked interest across departments. Not applause, not excitement, interest. But Kennedy didn't need cheers. She needed silence, calculation, space. She looked out over the auditorium, past rows of professors, graduate students, Nobel candidates, and skeptics. Cameras lined the back wall. The stream was live on 3 science networks and 12 university channels. She took one final breath and began. Most models of entangled particles fail in rotational frames, because most assume a stable inertial environment. But what if the failure isn't in the math but in the axis? She tapped a key. The particle split on screen, then drifted, each piece rotating around a center that subtly shifted. Then it stabilized. She zoomed in. A new axis appeared, calculated dynamically from torque imbalance and relativistic spin drift. That axis wasn't in standard models. It was hers. I used a dynamic z-axis derived from lens theory corrections. The result? Stable entanglement fidelity, under rotational drag. She turned. This was considered a dead end. My professor told me it was too advanced for me. But physics doesn't care about rank. It cares about truth. Gasps. Actual gasps. She moved to her next slide, a side-by-side comparison of Alden's original lab experiment and her revised setup. She highlighted the error in torque application and showed how it would corrupt data above a certain angular velocity. This experiment wasn't just flawed, it was dangerous. A professor in the 3rd row squinted. Where's your citation for the modified axis calculation? I derived it independently, Kennedy said. But it's cross-verified through simulations available on my public repository. The hash is embedded on this slide. She clicked again. The screen filled with animated code, not flashy, just clean, precise, labeled with her name and the dates of revision. This is my work, entirely. For a few seconds no one moved. Then a voice rose, slow, hesitant, curious. Did you just patch a quantum classical interaction model? With a rotational correction no one's tried in 2 decades? Kennedy smiled. Yes. And it held across 9,000 iterations. The auditorium erupted. Some clapped. Others stood. A few skeptics pulled out their phones and started searching her paper, her GitHub, her proofs. But Kennedy didn't move. Because the work had always been enough. Now it was just finally being seen. By the end of her session, 3 institutions had requested access to her simulation. A doctoral student from Stanford asked for collaboration. A French physicist offered a visiting position. Still, it wasn't validation she sought. It was vindication. And quietly, behind the curtain, Dr. Raina Hollowell watched with a grin that reached her heart. She did it, Raina whispered to no one in particular. Kennedy stepped off the stage, shoulders back, mind sharp, and walked into a hallway lined with whispers that no longer had the power to break her. But Langston hadn't disappeared. While Kennedy was being applauded in Boston, back on campus, Professor Alden Munro was in his office, glass of bourbon in one hand, a printed article in the other. His plan had been simple: publish the stolen code anonymously, then claim authorship once the summit buzz died down. He hadn't expected Kennedy to accept the invitation. He hadn't expected her to outperform the room. But now?
Now he had to make a choice.
He leaned back, fingers tightening around the glass. Then he opened his private email. There, waiting, was a message from a contact in the university's legal team. Attached a PDF. Langston University Academic Statement of Disassociation. He smirked. If she wanted to play in the big leagues, she could do it without their name. He drafted a response, CCing the university press team. Effective immediately, Kennedy Walker is not authorized to represent Langston University in any academic capacity. Any appearances or materials affiliated with our institution are to be revoked. He hit send. Within 20 minutes, it was public. The headline broke just as Kennedy stepped out of the summit building into the cold Boston air. Langston student disavowed, amid rising fame. Walker, not authorized to represent university, officials say. Her phone buzzed again, and again. She froze on the sidewalk. Raina grabbed her elbow. Don't check that yet. But Kennedy already had. It didn't just disown her. It claimed her data had not been peer-reviewed under Langston's protocols, and warned that misrepresentation of affiliation could constitute academic fraud. They were trying to reframe her brilliance as theft, and they wanted her blackballed. Raina cursed under her breath. I knew they'd try this. But so soon. Kennedy's hands shook. Is this how they kill it? She asked quietly. After everything? Is this how they erase me again? No, Raina said. Because this time we're not fighting them in a hallway. We're fighting them with every eye already watching. But inside, Kennedy felt it. The burn of being brilliant, visible, and still unwanted. The next day, a journalist leaked internal university emails showing that Langston had tried to sell her research while denying her the right to claim it. The email leaked in the early morning, and by noon, it was everywhere. Screenshots plastered across every platform, an internal thread between Langston administrators and legal counsel, dated weeks before the Boston summit. Subject line: commercialization timeline. Walker's simulation model. Attached were files that detailed the university's intent to privately license Kennedy's rotational frame quantum model through a third-party research consultancy, without her name attached. In one email, a Langston official wrote, once the media buzz settles, the lab can reclaim the framework under Munro's supervision. It's a clean story if we isolate Walker's involvement early. They hadn't just disavowed her. They had tried to sell her, and the world saw it. For 48 hours, Kennedy's name dominated academic Twitter, TikTok explainers, YouTube news pods. Think pieces dropped hourly, Langston's racist rot, the price of silencing black genius, when the lab stops being neutral. But the university didn't issue an apology. They scheduled a private meeting. Dean Robert Lohman requested her presence off campus for discretion. Raina warned her not to go alone, but Kennedy insisted. If they're going to threaten me, she said, they're going to have to say it to my face. The meeting took place at a private conference center 10 miles from Langston. Quiet, no press, no eyes. Kennedy arrived in slacks, coat buttoned tight, documents tucked under her arm. Her shoes echoed through the marble lobby with defiance. Lohman was already seated in a private room on the second floor. The windows were tinted. There was no water, no notepad, just a table, 2 chairs, and a contract folder. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He waited for the door to close before speaking. You've become quite a headline, Miss Walker. Kennedy sat. I didn't ask to be. No, he said calmly. But you certainly enjoyed it. She didn't respond. Lehman opened the folder. We're prepared to resolve this. No lawsuits. No further investigation. No permanent marks on your record. You'll complete your degree remotely. Quietly. And once you've graduated, we part ways. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. That's your offer? He nodded. In exchange, you will publicly retract your claims against Professor Monroe and Langston University. You will state that the leak was unauthorized and based on contextual misunderstanding. That you were emotional. Under stress. That you regret the damage caused to our institution's reputation. Kennedy laughed. Soft but bitter. You want me to lie? He leaned forward. I want you to graduate. You want to work in this field, don't you? I am working in it. He shook his head slowly. No, you're famous in it. That's not the same. Fame doesn't last. Recommendations do. Research placements do. If you walk away from this without our endorsement, you won't get into another lab on the East Coast. We'll make sure of that. She stared at him. Stunned. He wasn't even hiding it. He opened another folder. This one marked disciplinary action proposal. The top page read, Academic dishonesty, unauthorized use of institutional property. Kennedy's throat tightened. You're going to accuse me of stealing my own research? He folded his hands. If you refuse our offer, we move forward with the dishonesty charge. And with the donor board watching, we'll make it stick. Universities don't eat their own, unless they have to. But you've already been cut loose. Kennedy felt her heart hammering. You're doing this because I'm black. Lehman didn't flinch. We're doing this because you're dangerous. There it was. Not just the racism. The fear. The institution's panic. He leaned in. Drop it, he said, voice like a noose, or you'll never work again. She sat perfectly still, like her body might betray her, if she moved. For a moment her mind flicked to safety, to her mother, to what it would mean to finish the degree, and never say another word. She could accept their deal. They'd wipe her record. Let her vanish. A quiet ending. A footnote. But that's what they wanted all along, for her to vanish. For her to stay brilliant behind closed doors. For her name to be left out of the buildings and the books. She looked down at the table. At the line where her signature would go. Then she looked up, and she smiled. Do you want to know what's funny? She said softly. Lehman didn't answer. I already have 4 offers from national labs. They watched my summit presentation. They read the paper you tried to bury. I don't need Langston's signature anymore. He blinked. I brought my own pen. She stood, pulled out her own folder, and slid it across the table. Inside a notarized letter from the American Physics Association, confirming her independent authorship of the model. A memo from the National Quantum Lab, inviting her to speak. And lastly, a pre-approved legal notice, stating that Langston's disavowal could constitute retaliatory discrimination under federal academic policy. Lehman's face darkened. Kennedy leaned over the table. You don't own me, she said. You never did. Then she turned to go.
At the door, she paused. And Dean?
He looked up, jaw tight. I'm not the only one. There are more of us coming. And they're watching how you treat the first. She left without looking back. The next day, Kennedy's story aired on 60 Minutes. Not a scandal piece. A profile. Her face on screen. Her name in the headline. From erased to exceptional. The student who reshaped physics. Clips from her summit talk played alongside commentary from Raina Hollowell, professors across the country, and even a former Langston alum, who admitted on air that black students had been sidelined for years. But the most viral moment came when Kennedy looked directly into the camera and said, They told me to be quiet. They offered me safety in exchange for silence. But if I accepted that, I'd be confirming their worst assumption, that I didn't deserve to be heard in the first place. The video hit 10 million views in 2 days. Langston's inbox flooded. Donors pulled funding. Petitions launched. A group of students staged a sit-in outside Alden Monroe's office, holding signs that read, Too sensitive, too black, too female, too brilliant to ignore. Still, Kennedy remained quiet online. She didn't celebrate. She built. She returned to her code. Finalized her framework. Prepared to publish her full dataset in the International Journal of Quantum Models. But then, just as she prepared to send it off, a letter arrived. Not from Langston. From the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division. Subject. Formal investigation initiated. Allegations of systemic academic discrimination at Langston University. Kennedy opened the envelope and saw her name listed not as a respondent, but as the primary witness. The Langston Science Center hadn't seen this much media presence in its 11 to 18-year history. News vans parked like soldiers in rows, satellite dishes pointing skyward. Journalists moved briskly through the quad, earpieces in, voices urgent. Students leaned from dorm balconies with their phones held high, recording every second. The university tried to reroute foot traffic, but the barricades were symbolic at best. This wasn't something that could be contained anymore. Kennedy stood at the edge of the podium, heart steady, palms dry. She'd already read the statement to herself 3 times. She knew the order, the cadence, the weight of every word. But this wasn't just about delivery. This was about exposure and survival. Behind her stood Dr. Raina Hollowell, her mentor and silent anchor. To Kennedy's left, an attorney from the Civil Rights Division. To her right, 4 student researchers, 2 from Langston, 2 from other Ivy campuses, each holding folders of data they had independently verified. In front of her, the press, bright lights, dozens of microphones, hundreds of eyes waiting for a crack, a stumble, a mistake. Kennedy adjusted the mic. "My name is Kennedy Walker," she began. "I am, or rather was, a physics student at Langston University. I was admitted on full academic scholarship. I earned every inch of space I occupied in that lab. I solved problems that stumped my professors. I published work that should have been celebrated. Instead, I was silenced, erased, threatened, and nearly destroyed." The crowd was dead silent. She continued. "What happened to me at Langston is not an isolated event. It is the result of a long, silent tradition, one that rewards gatekeeping and punishes audacity when it comes in black female form." She opened a folder, held up a printed email. "This is a university memo discussing the management of my visibility, sent before my project was even complete." She raised another. "This is a time-stamped log, showing my files were accessed and deleted remotely from a faculty server, the night before my disciplinary review." And another. "This is the original version of my quantum model, with metadata and digital signature, matched against the version Langston submitted to a third-party consultant, with my name removed." Click, click. The reporters scribbled, snapped, murmured. "I'm not here for revenge," Kennedy said. "I'm here for the truth, because Langston taught me something, not through its curriculum, but through its silence, that sometimes science doesn't fail you, people do." She exhaled. "And if I don't say this out loud, they'll do it to the next girl, and the next, and the next." Raina stepped forward and placed her hand lightly on Kennedy's shoulder, then addressed the crowd. "I was Kennedy's mentor in high school. I now teach and conduct research at Emory University. What I saw in Langston's documents is what many of us have suspected for years, that diversity is a brand, not a practice in most elite scientific institutions. What Kennedy experienced wasn't unfortunate. It was orchestrated. More flashes, more gasps. Then Kennedy stepped back to the mic. "I don't need Langston's name. It needs mine. And now the world knows it." With that, she folded her notes, nodded once, and walked away from the podium. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't expect it. The roar came anyway. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you plan to sue? What about Alden Monroe? Will you return if they reinstate you? What does justice look like for you?" She didn't answer, because justice wasn't a line item. It was a shift, a reckoning, a rewiring of the very circuits Langston thought it had mastered. Within hours, networks ran the press conference in full. CNN aired it during prime time. MSNBC dubbed her the student who didn't fold. Hashtags trended globally. Nan Kennedy was right. Langston leak. Black and STEM. Across the Ivy League, student protests ignited. Brown, Yale, Princeton, Cornell. Everywhere the story echoed. Students held teach-ins, demanded accountability, and forced departments to audit hiring practices, lab access, and grading transparency. At Langston, students held a sit-in that lasted 6 days. They filled the hallway outside Alden Monroe's office with printed pages of Kennedy's paper, taped to the walls, the floor, the doors. Someone spray-painted on the marble steps of the science hall. Too smart to silence. Alumni pulled donations. Faculty scrambled to distance themselves. And then, just as the momentum reached its fever pitch, Langston's Board of Trustees announced a rare emergency session, one they made public. Students, reporters, and faculty packed the auditorium. Live-streamed screens were set up across campus. Kennedy watched from Raina's apartment in Atlanta, surrounded by stacks of her simulation reports and a framed copy of her summit invite. The board chair stepped to the mic. We recognize the pain and betrayal felt by our students, alumni, and community. We recognize the systemic failures that allowed this harm to occur. Today we issue a formal apology to Kennedy Walker, and effective immediately. He paused. The room leaned forward. Professor Alden Monroe has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The audience erupted, but the chair held up a hand. That is not all. The university will also conduct an external audit of all student disciplinary actions from the past 10 years, and will suspend current academic dishonesty cases where bias may have influenced outcome. Gasps, cries, applause. But the final line stole the air from the room. We have also initiated a review of Langston's STEM program's affiliation with corporate donors, including Halberton Dynamics, who were named in recent leaks. Their funding will be paused until ethical review is complete. Kennedy stared at the screen. She had come into this thinking she'd be lucky to finish her degree in silence. Now the walls were coming down, but she knew better than to call this a win. It wasn't over. Because walls don't fall overnight. They crack, they shudder, they take hits, and then someone finally pushes hard enough. Today she had pushed. As cameras panned the crowd in Langston's auditorium, a familiar face appeared in the back row. Alden Monroe, not leaving, not hiding, but smiling. It didn't happen all at once. Alden Monroe wasn't dragged out of his office. There were no handcuffs, no shouting matches on front pages, no tearful exits under fluorescent lights. He didn't even flinch when the Board of Trustees announced the investigation. In fact, for a time he remained smug, convinced that tenure would shield him, that Langston's hunger for prestige would outweigh its tolerance for public shaming. But Langston couldn't hold the line forever, not when the emails kept leaking. Not when multiple students past and present came forward to say they too had been excluded from authorship, penalized for asserting independence, or pressured into silence after receiving high praise from external institutions. The final blow came not from a journalist, not from Kennedy, but from within. A junior faculty member, Dr. Amanda Singh, who had quietly reviewed Alden's publications over the past decade, submitted a 43-page report to the university's ethics committee. The findings were explosive. At least 5 of Alden's published research papers contained unattributed code or analysis lifted from student drafts. 2 data models, hailed by Alden as breakthrough work, had originated in a discontinued undergraduate capstone project. And most damning of all, his name had appeared on projects he'd had little to no technical involvement in, including Kennedy's. It became impossible to deny. Langston issued a formal notice. Professor Alden Monroe is no longer affiliated with Langston University. He has voluntarily stepped down following the emergence of new information about research misconduct and professional ethics violations. But Kennedy knew better. There was nothing voluntary about it. She received the news on a Friday afternoon while attending a quiet think tank roundtable in Atlanta. Raina had been presenting on systemic barriers in grant funding. Kennedy was there as a silent contributor, observing, listening, writing. Her phone buzzed. Just one line from a fellow student still inside Langston. "He's gone. Your name's back on the wall." She sat still for a full minute, before letting herself feel it. The air shifted. She had outlasted him. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy's name began appearing in the kinds of places that couldn't be erased. Her simulation model was adopted into 2 physics curriculums. As a case study in quantum entanglement correction, she was invited to consult on a cross-departmental initiative between NASA and MIT for testing rotational quantum field stability in microgravity. It wasn't symbolic.
They weren't hiring her for a headline.
They were hiring her for her math. She spent most of her days now in labs with no windows, fingers moving fast over terminals as she built models with international teams who didn't flinch when she corrected their errors, who didn't question her presence in the room. The work finally spoke for itself. Still, Langston lingered in her bones. One afternoon, after a conference in D.C., Kennedy returned to the campus for the first time since the summit. She didn't tell anyone. No press, no students, just her in the past, waiting for a reckoning. The science building hadn't changed. The same smell of copper and chalk, the same linoleum tiles, half buffed, but the silence felt different now, like it had learned how to hold shame. She walked past the old lecture hall, where Alden once told her she was just a girl. She walked past the lab where they tried to erase her name, And finally, she stood outside the glass cabinet where student achievements were displayed. Her name was etched into a brass plate now. Not paper, not temporary. Kennedy Walker.
BS Physics.
Rotational quantum model. Cited by NASA, Emory, and MIT. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She just nodded. As she turned to leave, a student passed her. Freshman, maybe sophomore, black girl with her hair braided back into a bun, lab notebook in one hand. She looked at Kennedy, froze. Are you? Kennedy smiled. I am. The girl's eyes lit up. You're why I came here, she said softly. I didn't think I could, until I read your paper. Kennedy placed a hand over her chest. Thank you, she whispered. They parted with no photos, no fanfare. Just understanding. As she stepped into the old lab one last time, room 212, the walls didn't press in anymore. The shadows didn't whisper doubt. The silence didn't question her. And on the workbench where she used to sit, a single envelope waited. No name. Just for her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. The script was uneven, but unmistakable. Alden Monroe, you win. I never expected you to. I thought I could outmaneuver you, bury you, like I've done with others. But you're different. You were always different. You were never afraid of the work. You just refused to let the room define you. I don't apologize. I'm not wired for that. But I do acknowledge it now. The math was yours. The moment was yours. The future is yours. Don't stop moving. Don't stop proving. They'll try again. Not just to you. To the ones who come after. Make sure they find a door open. There was no signature. Just a blank space. Kennedy folded the letter once. Then again. She placed it back into the envelope and slid it under the table where no one would find it. Where it would stay, like all ghosts should. She turned off the lab lights. But before stepping out, she whispered into the dark. I already built the door. As Kennedy stepped into the sunlight, her phone buzzed. A message from NASA. Her model had just passed its first test in orbit. The letter came in a plain white envelope with no return address, no school seal, no stamp of approval. It had been hand-delivered to the front desk at Kennedy's temporary office at the NASA Quantum Systems Initiative. No courier, just a name scribbled in block letter. For Dr. Kennedy Walker. She wasn't officially a doctor yet. Not by degree, not by tradition. But something about seeing it written like that stirred something deep in her. Not pride, something older. Recognition. She sat down at her desk surrounded by the quiet hum of computers processing particle simulations in zero gravity, and opened the letter with careful fingers. Inside, a single sheet of lined notebook paper, handwritten. The kind of loops only a middle schooler makes when trying to write neat but still pouring emotion through the ink. Dear Dr. Kennedy, my name is Jayla. I'm 13. I saw you on the news. My teacher showed us your speech. I didn't know black girls could be physicists. I didn't know we were allowed to do that. You made me want to try. I told my mom I want to learn about gravity, and black holes and spin things that nobody understands yet. She said she didn't know how, but she'd find someone who does. I told her I already found someone. I found you. Thank you for not quitting. Kennedy read it once. Then again, she didn't cry. She let the words settle into her chest like mass shifting her center of gravity. It had all come full circle now. The institutional theft, the erasure, the whisper campaigns, the red marks, the lost notebooks, the threatened future. They had tried everything to make her doubt she belonged. But this girl, this 13-year-old stranger with paper and hope, proved that she had landed somewhere far more permanent than the lab at Langston. She had landed in the imagination of someone who'd been told not to dream that big. That was the kind of gravity you couldn't simulate. You had to live it. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy's schedule remained full. Her model, now dubbed Walker's spin stability equation, had passed 3 rounds of simulations aboard the ISS. A full paper was being reviewed for publication in physical review letters. She had been invited to co-develop a new branch of rotational entropy logic with Emory and Caltech. But she still kept Jayla's letter in her bag. Every room she entered, from high-level symposiums to quiet backdoor meetings about science policy reform, she carried that folded piece of lined paper next to her ID badge. Because Jayla wasn't just a fan letter. She was the reason. Kennedy had always thought the point of getting in was to prove she could stay. But now she knew. The point was to make sure the door stayed open behind her. And she was already making changes. She had launched a mentorship fund for black girls in STEM, called Just a Girl Inc., a nod to the words that had once been used to break her. Raina helped run it. So did other women, who had once been silenced by labs and lectures and tenured doubt. They offered grants, peer pairing, shadowing programs, no tests, just access. Because access had always been the real gate. One afternoon, Kennedy returned to Langston not to speak, not to protest, but to interview candidates. The university had been forced to create a new ethics board, one with student representation, and Kennedy had been invited to serve as an external reviewer. She walked into the same marble building that once questioned if she belonged, now wearing a badge that said senior consultant. And they called her by her full name, every time. In the hallway, a professor stopped her. Younger, new, wide-eyed. "Dr. Walker," he said. "It's an honor." She offered a small smile. "Let's not forget that a year ago, saying my name was a risk." He nodded slowly, but she didn't say it to shame him. She said it to remind herself. Truth reshapes memory, but justice rewrites the rules. That evening, Kennedy sat alone in the courtyard where it had all begun, the same place Alden Monroe once gave her the just a girl smirk that started the war. Now, it was quiet, but not empty. New voices floated from windows. New students moved with confidence. The air had shifted. She thought about all the names who never got this far. Brilliant students who were told their math was too chaotic, their ideas too radical, their tone too confident. She thought about the ones who dropped out, the ones who changed majors, the ones who transferred quietly, never telling anyone that they left, not because they weren't good enough, but because they were too good, and someone felt threatened. How many Jaylas had never found someone to write to? How many Kennedys never got the second chance? She took a deep breath and looked at the sky. Not as something far away, but as something near, something she'd touched now, with math, with grit, with a refusal to stay small. And she asked herself the question she'd carried silently for months. How many brilliant minds have we silenced because they didn't look the part? There was no answer, only a mission. And Kennedy Walker, the girl who was never supposed to get in, who they tried to break, who they called too sensitive, too black, too female, stood now at the very center of the future they could no longer control. Because she hadn't just rewritten an equation. She'd rewritten the laws that once kept people like her out. They told her she was too much, too sensitive, too black, too female, to belong in a space built to keep her out. But she stayed, she fought, and she changed everything. Because brilliance has no color, and silence should never be the price of survival. Type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart.